Hello. Well, welcome to today's event on the geopolitics of the pandemic and Southeast Asian regionalism as part of Asia Society Australia's Southeast Asia and COVID-19 project. Now, just before we begin, Asia Society acknowledges that many participants in today's event are dialing in from locations that have traditional owners and custodians. So I acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. Also like to welcome and acknowledge any Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander or other First Nations people joining us today. Now, as you will know from the program, since you've signed up, we're going to be examining how Southeast Asian countries and ASEAN as an institution have been managing the COVID crisis and what it means for them into the future months, into the years ahead. Now, before I turn to our speakers, just a little bit about the program, which won't be that surprising if you tuned into our other webinar events. We'll have about a 20-minute discussion with our three speakers and then move to Q&A. But if you have some questions, please post them along the way, and if they're relevant to the conversation as I talk to the panelists, I'll try to pick them up. You can submit your questions through the YouTube chat box at any time. Also, you can access the Southeast Asia and COVID-19 website from which this panel today is essentially drawn using the link in the chat box. So now turning to our speakers. Richard Maude will be a familiar face to anyone who's been tuning into Asia Society Australia webinars and other events over the course of the past year. He's a former senior Australian diplomat, but now he's the Senior Fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute, which is based in Washington. But Richard's also the Director of Policy at Asia Society Australia. So good to see you again, Richard. Now, but more importantly, our other guests here today, who are probably less familiar faces to some of you perhaps. Huong Li is from the the Australia Strategic Policy Institute, she's the Senior Analyst in the Defence and Strategy Program there. But Huong, who's been on Asia Society Australia events before, I'm sure some people will appreciate, has also worked at the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies. That's relevant because our other guest today is Sharon Seah, who is the coordinator of the ASEAN Studies Centre at ISIS Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore, and she is the real expert on ASEAN since she spends all the time thinking and talking about it. So welcome all of you. Now, I think perhaps we might turn to begin with to the recent round of summits across the region, which were meant to be basically hosted in Vietnam this year, but have been a little upset by the COVID-19 pandemic, and so have mostly been held virtually and online. Now, Sharon, you watch these things very closely and even read the communiques more than most people do, I think. What do you think were the principal outcomes of the summits for the ASEAN countries, and how have they managed to respond to the pandemic in managing the summits this year?
Right. Thanks, Greg, for the introduction. I'm very pleased to be invited on this panel, and thank you also to the Asia Society Australia. I try as best as I can to follow the events. I think COVID this year has really derailed so many plans for ASEAN, but many of the initiatives that have come out from the recent 37th ASEAN summits are actually related to a COVID-19 response. So on the COVID front, they've adopted an ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework and its implementation plan, a kind of a regional reserve of medical supplies for public health emergencies. There are also plans now in place for an ASEAN Center for Public Health Emergencies and Emerging Diseases. That's akin to an ASEAN CDC. And then there was a declaration on an ASEAN travel corridor arrangement. And of course, earlier in April, they've committed to set up a COVID-19 ASEAN Response Fund. And a lot of canvassing, I think, has gone into that to try to get pledges. ASEAN member states have also themselves pledged to that fund. So these are all announced initiatives aimed at immediate COVID response, building preparedness, improving capacity and capabilities, but we will take some time before we see actual concrete action. So for instance, the ASEAN travel corridor arrangement has been talked about since April, but the harmonization of common protocols is difficult still because of the different phases of the outbreak and recovery process in different countries. And similarly, this ASEAN CDC idea that they have is also an idea that's occasionally been surfaced, say after SARS, but now only seriously thought about, and it will likely take some time before they can agree on terms of reference, the host country, arrangements and so on. So these are just really startup initiatives, I would call them, and it won't we won't see action till maybe in the next year or so. The other things they've done is to maintain supply chain connectivity. So I think that's very important in the early days of the response to COVID, to ensure that essential supplies continue to flow across the region. So there was an MOU on essential goods flow at this recent summit. And on the trade front, of course, RCEP was a very big, well, it's like a shining light at the end of this long COVID tunnel, isn't it? And everyone's put kind of hopes that RCEP will revive this region. But besides that, there's also the bread and butter work that they've been doing on economic integration. So there was the ASEAN-wide self-certification, and there's the customs transit system. Customs declaration document was passed, and the signing of the ATIGA, the ASEAN Trade and Services Agreement. So all these actually, they show you that the economic officials have been working overtime to try and put together a package that would help the region. I'm also very happy to note that there's been a lot more talk on gender. So the women, peace and security item came up both in the summit and in the EAS. So I hope to see, of course, more gender mainstreaming in ASEAN, and it's timely because women suffer disproportionate impact of COVID during the lockdown.
Okay, thank you. Interesting. Now, these summits aren't just about ASEAN, even though ASEAN likes to see itself at the centre of them. What do you think the other countries, the dialogue partners who come along, are focused on this year, and were they sort of constrained by the fact these summits were really online, and did that sort of limit the role of the dialogue partners this year?
Yeah, I think there's not a meeting that hasn't got the word COVID somehow embedded in it. So this year, with the dialogue partners as well as in the EAS and ARF, the COVID definitely took up a lot of headspace, mind space. And the talk really there is how to help each other, how to ensure a coherent regional response. And of course, the geopolitical discussions on the, issues that's been affecting ASEAN, the South China Sea, whereas the major power rivalries, those issues were also discussed as well. So it's not all swept under the carpet because of COVID. I think these are all realities that ASEAN has to live with. On the meetings, I think Australia and NZ has it the worst because of the time differences. But I think apart from that, going online, it took some practice. So from about March or so, I think some meetings were already going online. And then thereafter, it was a steep learning curve for everyone. But I understand at the officials level, they've adopted kind of an omnibus format to tabling agenda items, and it's sort of kind of moved quite expediently in passing some of the agenda items. I don't know how that kind of, ASEAN works on this idea of building support and camaraderie amongst the leaders, and they need that time, that face time to be together. I don't know though how that has worked out for the leaders. Yeah.
Do you think there'll be more online summits, or will they really want to go back to face-to-face meetings as soon as possible?
I think it might be a hybrid. So where there's a chance for the leaders to meet, I think the officials would want that. But where working meetings are concerned, it might be more efficient to just do it online.
Okay, sure. Interesting. So Huong, turning to you now, this was really meant to be Vietnam's big year in ASEAN, maybe even bigger on the global stage, hosting these summits. So how do you think Vietnam's managed the year given the constraints of COVID and constraints of having to do the summits virtually. I think you might need to unmute, perhaps. Is that? I think you may be muted still, Huong.
All right. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, good.
Thanks. Great.
Yeah, my control buttons got frozen for a while. Yeah, I think for Vietnam it was a very busy year. I think Vietnam had very big ambitions for the year. Unfortunately, some of that had been curbed by the pandemic. I think up until even early this year, even after the pandemic outbreak, Vietnam had hoped that some of the meeting can be physical. So it even planned the mid-year meetings to be in Da Nang. And because Vietnam did so well with the pandemic and was the first country in Southeast Asia to open up, to release the social distancing restrictions in late April, it had hoped that by July it can bring at least some to Da Nang, but unfortunately that didn't happen because Vietnam also had a small but second wave precisely in Da Nang. So that didn't happen. They had to postpone some of the meetings which happened online, which happened virtually. And I think there was some concern in initial phase, just in terms of logistics, just in terms of digital capability of everyone and how things will work on the online platform. As you know, the ASEAN culture is a culture of socializing and really informal contact, informal and discussion and negotiation often behind the closed door before any statement comes out. As you know, ASEAN, it's been well-known fact that for ASEAN, the diplomacy, it's about retreats, it's about leaders playing golf together, it's really spending time together, but that obviously couldn't happen under the COVID. So, but despite all of those difficulties, I think it's one of more productive years. According to the reports, there were some over 80 agreements, some of that Sharon already listed. So it's actually record high in the history of ASEAN. Which means that being virtual or being remote doesn't cut on productivity. Some of those agreements have been long-standing and under negotiation for a long time, but some of them are new. For example, travel bubble discussion or digital tourism, things like were triggered by the COVID and the COVID restrictions. And initially, also, I think many had expected that Vietnam would very much be focused on South China Sea, and even the whole chairmanship will be very much focused on the traditional security issues, and South China Sea will dominate the agenda. It did feature, and it did feature significantly given the earlier statement in September and earlier mentions in the ASEAN discussion, as well as documents about the United Nations Convention of Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, mentions about the 2016 ruling of the Philippines and China's case, and mentioned that the legality of the claims. So all of the important mentions were there and discussions were there in terms of South China Sea issues and tensions and militarizations, but absolutely it did not dominate the whole year. As Sharon mentioned, there are a lot of discussion on economic recovery, about development, about recovery after the COVID, about bridging the developmental gap within the Southeast Asians. So those are agenda that all Southeast Asian members could get on board with. Unlike the South China Sea, for example. So I think as a chair, Vietnam did a good job balancing between in between the harder issues but also the issues that could bring everyone together, which is the agenda for cooperation and development. So overall, I would give quite high marks for Vietnam's chairmanship, given the challenges of the COVID and the great power competition and all the other challenges around. And I think, ASEAN's performance a lot depends on chairman's personality. And this year, Vietnam showed its strong strategic capability. But it is an ongoing process. Next year, we have Brunei and Cambodia. And those are the framework that at least China wants to, within these 2 years, for the code of conduct in the South China Sea negotiation to be finalized. So those are very critical years ahead, and how ASEAN performs as an organization and how the region recovers from this very critical time.
Thanks, Huong. Just stepping back a little bit from this year, or the summit precisely, how do you think Vietnam, where does Vietnam sit in the ASEAN sort of hierarchy these days? It's a large country, a large population, large economy, but it's a relatively new member compared with the original members. So it sort of is in the middle between the very small, less developed new countries and the old countries. So, I mean, where's Vietnam going to sit in the long term in ASEAN as a result of this year and how it's evolving?
Yes, I think it's evolving, and one of faster evolving members of ASEAN. When it joined, it was obviously it was quite big a controversy around its joining, because this was a former really adversary of the ASEAN bloc, which was anti-communist at the time of the forming. Vietnam gradually, obviously, made the preparations to join in the 1990s, and it brought along Cambodia, Laos, and also advocated for extension to Myanmar. So other Southeast Asians joined to make up the 10, and at that time, Vietnam, among those new members, were bracketed as the tier 2 countries in ASEAN, and had different deadlines in terms of ASEAN economic goals and integration. I think by now nobody in ASEAN considered Vietnam the second tier anymore. It's been in the gray zone in the middle for some time, but I think Vietnam has been quite active member with many initiatives, not only during this chairmanship, but the chairmanships before, including the ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting plus as one of Vietnamese claim to be its initiative. It's very much active supporter of ASEAN in terms of within ASEAN as a regional diplomatic initiative, but also I think in terms of taking up on difficult agendas, including the traditional security agenda, and obviously everything points to the South China Sea as a case. And I think Vietnam, because this year as a chairmanship, had already very high expectations on its performance. And I think because it done such a good job with dealing with the pandemic itself, its regional reputation also increased. So I think as the time goes and as the process evolves, Vietnam remains more invested in ASEAN than comparative some of ASEAN members. And obviously that is fluctuating. We have different leadership in different member countries, and that will continue to fluctuate. But because in Vietnam, the leadership and governance is quite stable with a one-party system, the commitment to ASEAN and the view on ASEAN won't change that much, and not in a fast way, at least.
Okay, thank you. Now, this Asia Society project is really focused on the pandemic more broadly than the summit itself. So I think maybe we should turn a little bit to that. Sharon, just so back, moving away from the summit, just looking at the year, I suppose, how do you think ASEAN as an institution, I think has managed the pandemic, or how do you think the countries individually have managed the pandemic? I guess there's been a lot of criticism for ASEAN being slow off the mark and that sort of thing, but do you think that's fair? And so just generally speaking, how do you think the year's gone in the region?
Thanks for that question. So I think that ASEAN really rolled with the punches this year, and they took whatever came to them. So when the pandemic first hit, I think Thailand was the first country to report a case. There was early confusion in the early months of January because the WHO kind of delayed the announcement of calling the pandemic a public health emergency of international concern. But prior to that already, ASEAN had been utilizing its own existing mechanisms to exchange information with the +3 countries. The epidemiologists were working together, and then they have various initiatives like the Emergency Operations Center Network and the Risk Assessment Center, they all came together and worked on the issues while waiting for the WHO to make its announcement. Individually, I think it's clear that national responses were top for this region. So as the pandemic spread, countries closed their borders and there were travel restrictions put in place. I think that's all very natural in any kind of crisis, be it health or security. Countries tend to do that to protect its own population and to cut off transmission. So it's a natural course of action. But following that, I think they came together quite quickly in April with a special summit, and then they examined what sort of cooperative actions they could take. And it sort of mirrored also what was happening nationally, where the health teams were taking the lead and making the decisions. Then gradually in July, August, we started to see the economic people coming into the conversation and pushing the narrative towards a better recovery, towards thinking of a kind of a recovery for ASEAN. So overall, I think the early criticisms were there, but ASEAN has sort of turned it around, but it still remains to be seen what some of these initiatives would really yield. I do need to put in a word though. So some of the things that they do need to lay out they have to coordinate between the pillars, the sectors, and the different bodies. So for instance, there's recognition now that the zoonotic diseases actually have a big interface between animal health, human health, and planetary systems. So now there's talk in some of the discussions about using the One Health approach. So I think ASEAN needs to coordinate between themselves, between the working groups and sectoral bodies to come together to prepare for the next pandemic and not be caught off course and off guard. A word for the ASEAN Secretariat, of course. So a lot of the coordination work needs to be taken up by a body, an entity that is empowered to do that work. And I think the ASEAN Secretariat is lacking. It needs a boost in funding and manpower. It's not lacking in itself, but the fact that it's lacking in funding and manpower, and it's felt quite sorely this year with, as Huong said, productivity has been up. So you can imagine the ASEAN Secretariat officials are all working overtime to get all of the commitments out there. And implementation is key. So declarations and statements will mean nothing if at the end of the day nothing's done on the ground.
How well are they managing to actually look forward to the next pandemic when you've got still a quite significant problem, certainly in countries like Indonesia and the Philippines? I think Thailand's got an outbreak just that's happened in the last few days, a less significant one than those other two. So it's hard to focus on the next pandemic when you're still, in a lot of cases, dealing with the current pandemic. I think you're all wearing masks outside in Singapore still now, for example. So it's quite a visual manifestation of the pandemic still being significant, even in Singapore.
Yeah. And sometimes I do worry if the world is ever going to get out of masks and safe. But on the health sectoral, I think they are going to be fast forwarding some of the initiatives. So for instance, there were plans for regional laboratory networks. So they have to really get on the double for some of these initiatives that were already planned for and in place. They do have that ASEAN CDC idea that I talked about. I think if they were really serious, then some serious money is got to go towards setting that up and putting the right people in, attracting the talents into that center, and ensuring that there is proper coordination with the national CDCs.
Sure.
So not just a regional one, and then build up the early detection programs and surveillance as well. So yes, it's hard to see when the next big one's going to hit, but I think amongst the leaders and officials, there's a sense that it's not if another pandemic, but when another pandemic will hit the world.
Okay, thank you. So Huong, just shifting the lens to even a broader sort of perspective on the pandemic in the region, how do you think it's changed the big story in the region, the conflict, the tension between the US and China? How have the year's events really changed that rivalry?
I think in the beginning of the pandemic, everybody thought that pandemic itself won't change much. It's accelerator rather than a game changer. I tend to think differently. I think it is a big disruptor and probably more than we would have accounted for. And I think the impact of the pandemic is much beyond just the immediate phase of disruption, which we are still in, which is, public health crisis, the death toll, unfortunately, and also the economic recovery. But I think the recovery phase will take much longer and probably more complicated and in some cases harder. So it's going to change, and that phase will also have a lot of changes to be accounted for. So we are just seeing the beginning, and I think it's already quite significant because yes, it has accelerated many existing trends, the US-China competition being one of them, the trade issues, but also domestically, some of the issues with that are labeled like democratic retreat, for example, or the quality of governance within Southeast Asian countries. Yes, they have accelerated, but beyond that, there are a number of issues that have not been it could have been really different if not for the pandemic. Arguably, the results of the US election, arguably changing also for another 4, 5 or even more years, setting the course, 4 years, sorry, 4 and more, and setting the course not only for US and partners and allies, but actually, the China policy, Asia, the Indo-Pacific policies. So there are a lot of changes. Also, there's a disruption in terms of non-accounted for, in terms of economic growth pattern. Indonesia, for example, was poised to be very fastly growing, reaching the big economies in soon with record growth. But it has been now recorded officially recession after 2 decades. It's probably going to take longer than some other countries to recover, given the very severe outbreak still at the moment. Similarly, might be with the situation in the Philippines and Myanmar. We still, we're not seeing end of it yet. So I think Southeast Asia in general will be a very different region after we can talk about because the pandemic has affected the region in a different way, and the recovery will be different and might be not synchronized. There may be, some countries that are going to recover pretty fast, like Vietnam and Singapore, which are at least projected so. But some will take a long, long time, and that, of course, will affect the geopolitical considerations. So I think the region will continue to be more diverse, even more than it was before the pandemic. There are challenges to its narrowing development gap. In fact, it is a challenge for the ASEAN process of bringing that regionalism together. And I think it will be challenging to use still in the future Southeast Asia as a single geostrategical unit. And I think there are a number of challenges to that. That's why the ASEAN process, that's why ASEAN as institution is so important to keep that. Otherwise, there will be quite more factors that pull the region to different directions. So I think it only complicates the Southeast Asian story.
Okay, thank you. Now we are moving on through this webinar. If anyone has any questions, please post them because we're going to soon start running out of time otherwise. Now, Richard, Huong's raised questions there about the long-term future of ASEAN and its centrality in the broader regional architecture. So that raises I guess the big question of how well structured is the ASEAN-centred architecture that we've seen at work in the summits in dealing with these out of left field issues like a pandemic, or the obvious big issues that we're well aware of, like the tension between superpowers. Does the architecture need to change?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Look, I think there's a bundle of issues tied up in that question, which seems deceptively simple, but is actually quite complex.
You've got 15 minutes.
Yeah. Look, I think the short answer is that ASEAN-centred architecture, and particularly the East Asia Summit, which, if you like, is sit at the pinnacle of this architecture, you can't reasonably expect it to be the answer to managing strategic tensions in the region. ASEAN itself is a broad church, as Huong said, and the East Asia Summit is even broader. It's a good forum for leader-level dialogue and some modest practical cooperation, but it simply wasn't designed to manage major power competition, and it's grappling with one of the most elemental functions of a world of nation states, and that's systemic major power rivalry. I don't think actually there are real alternatives out there. There are things that can complement and supplement the ASEAN-centred architecture, but we certainly, I don't think, should throw the baby out with the bathwater for a couple of reasons. One is the East Asia Summit, for example, and most of the ASEAN processes are very inclusive. So all the major regional players are at the table, and the alternatives are worse from an Australian perspective. We've worried in the past, for example, that ASEAN +3 and the idea of an East Asian economic community might start to take a hold and supplant a broader and more inclusive regionalism, and particularly economic regionalism. Secondly, this is a good umbrella under which countries like Australia can continue to help support ASEAN agency and resilience, because like everyone, they're definitely feeling the pressure. They don't want to be asked to take sides, but they also don't want to be left alone in the room with China, and they want help. I think thirdly, the leader level stuff is really important. This really, I think, hurt Australia this year, that we couldn't actually get to this meeting marketplace and sit down with a whole bunch of leaders, not least Premier Li and President Xi. But that is important to preserve. And then, it can set important norms of behaviour and principles on which we'd like the region to work. Now, it can't enforce those principles, but there's still value in setting them out, still value in being clear when they're not being adhered to. So, I think Australia is deeply committed to the East Asia Summit for all of those reasons. That doesn't mean, as I said, that we don't engage in other forums in the region and in other formats, but we see them.
Hello, Richard. I think you dropped out briefly then.
Sorry, am I back?
You're back now, yes. You're fine.
National Broadband Network.
Right.
Well, I think the last point, I don't know when I dropped out, was saying that there's those reasons that I was talking about, as much as you could hear them, arrive from an Australian perspective. We think that the East Asia Summit and the ASEAN-centred process are an important part of the regional architecture, and we don't want to see them undermined. Indeed, we want to keep strengthening them.
How do you think the growing a bunch of mini-laterals that Australia's involved in, some of them are virtually bilaterals, I suppose, or the three countries, do they fit into the ASEAN Summit structure, or do they really operate on the side independently? How do the two fit together?
Yeah, they operate on the side independently, but my own view is that they're complementary, and as I said, they're not designed to supplant or compete with the ASEAN-centred architecture. And of course, some ASEANs themselves are participating in this kind of minilateralism, especially Indonesia. It's inevitable that in the current era, countries are going to look to a range of groupings, including smaller groupings, to do things. Some of this is about strengthening ties to each other independent of the major powers, that is independent of both China and the United States. So the Australia, India, Indonesia triangle, for example, fits that mold perfectly. Some of it, of course, is more like the Quad, where you've got like-minded countries thinking how they can better contribute to building a regional order that favours our interests and keep the US engaged. The ASEANs were quite anxious about the Quad in 2017. I had a lot of conversations. I was still in government at that stage with my ASEAN counterparts. But I think a lot of that has settled. They've seen the incremental way in which it's developed, and they've also seen a much more assertive China in the past few years, so they're perhaps more conscious of the added role that a group like the Quad could play. And it's worth stepping back a bit from these types of arrangements, and they work at several levels. For Australia, ultimately, they're about supporting the idea of a more multipolar Indo-Pacific, where a range of countries and mechanisms have agency and roles to play. And this is, of course, the white paper agenda in the Indo-Pacific chapter. And this is not, especially not from an Australian perspective, about containing China, which is not possible or desirable, but it is about finding ways to balance China's power and prevent total domination of the region.
Thanks. We haven't talked very much about the individual ASEAN countries very much. We've been talking more about the institution and the regional architecture, I suppose. So, Richard, a lot of these countries are very internally focused at the moment due to their own, not just the pandemic, just due to their domestic politics. You can pick on any number of them, I suppose, but one of the more interesting ones at the moment is Thailand, a major country in ASEAN traditionally. It's very internally focused on its own democracy protests. Is that a distraction from ASEAN really maintaining this strong role in the broader Asian regional architecture if its individual members are distracted? Malaysia's having its own political problems because of constant charges to the Prime Minister at the moment.
Yes, well, look, I think definitely doesn't help. So ASEAN's grappling with a range of pressures at the moment. Huong mentioned the biggest one, which is what to do about China and how to manage the way China leans on ASEAN member countries, usually behind closed doors, but often in a pretty robust way, to make sure that ASEAN countries defer to China's interests. So that's one pressure, and Huang, I think, can talk a bit more about that. But we clearly see those signs of stresses. A second pressure is now the pandemic.
No, I think Richard may have dropped out again. Huong, you're online?
Yes,
well, he just virtually gave you a segue to buy into this question. I was going to ask you about the pressure on individual ASEAN countries from China. We saw that senior Singapore diplomat Bilahari Kausikan warned recently, I think more than talk, that ASEAN might have to do without Cambodia and Laos because of the pressure China is putting on them. That would be quite a profound thing for countries to leave ASEAN or be forced out. How do you see that sort of tension happening there in the group?
Well, that's a known secret within ASEAN that we have some countries that are probably more prone to influence and often challenge the ASEAN consensus, or at least when it comes to certain issues, and that has been the case with the South China Sea, and that was precisely Cambodia, and to some degree also Laos. But I think it's good to have this kind of voice, like Bilahari Kausikan mentioned, but I think that we shouldn't be expecting any Brexit or Chemzit or Laosit from ASEAN. And I think that would be really not useful for the whole process. Bringing Southeast Asian from the mainland into the process was precisely to mitigate any possible, wider regional tensions, and actually to mitigate those remaining tensions. If that doesn't success, then it doesn't look good on the ASEAN process overall. Studying ASEAN processes, ASEAN history, I think that would actually mean a failure of socializing ASEAN norms to the newer members. And it is a challenge. I think ASEAN, instead of trying to get rid of the members, should even work harder to socialize those ASEAN norms and ASEAN common interests to everyone, in not only Cambodia and Laos, but also some of the older members, to a degree, also have their view on ASEAN's value, also have faded under the new leadership, and notably Indonesia under Jokowi is investing less in ASEAN than it used to be in the history. And similarly, Philippines under Duterte is not as committed to the ASEAN processes as the Philippines before. So it's important to socialize those both norms, values, and interest, the ASEAN-wide interest to everyone all the time. It's a continuous process. But having said that, I do think that the point that Bilahari Kausikan made that is also valid in a way that not as, as harshly as getting rid of Cambodia or Laos, but to point out where are the consistent shortcomings and consistent behavior that are not welcome. And I think there could be another way without a formal exit to mitigate that. One way, and that has been practiced in history of ASEAN, is the ASEAN minus processes, where, for example, only certain countries within ASEAN, only certain member states get together to the issue specific, for example, counter-terrorism. So it's a form of minilateralism within ASEAN. And if Laos and Cambodia are persistently not in sync with the rest of ASEAN members in the issue of South China Sea, for example, it could be, a way out could be going ahead with discussion without them because they don't have the claims in the South China Sea per se. Of course, that would be very hard to get everyone on board, to have the consensus to go on the unilateral way. But I think there are, what I'm saying is that there are other ways than the hard exit.
Of course, this sounds...
Yeah.
Sorry, this sounds like a familiar theme to here in Australia, a bunch of countries which are very China-centred, dependent on China in various ways, not wanting to be China-centric. It's a sort of thing that we think about here, particularly this week with the new tensions with China. So do you think Australia can learn something from the way these ASEAN countries deal with China, or how do you...
Okay. What I think with the diplomacies, it's a very different position that Australia and Southeast Asians are, because
Sure.
Geographical proximity, historical context, all of that, and also the size, the capacity, the other security network, and so on and so forth. It's a very different position to be. And Australia is in a position to say things that not necessarily other Southeast Asians are in the position to say, for example, being a very vocal member of international community as Australia is. But what I've noticed since the great power competition, not even the pandemic, is really a serious decline of the quality of diplomacy overall. It has started before the pandemic, predominantly with the US way of conducting diplomatic conduct and diplomatic language, but also with China. I think it is, unfortunately, on the diplomatic front, it's a race to bottom, and the behavior of China and the way some official communication comes from China, and also there are other cases. Also, there have been cases with this, Pompeo's language was not very well welcome either. But in general, the trend of the quality of diplomacy has deteriorated. Now, we used to learn and study and teach at the university that diplomacy is high politics. Right now, it really doesn't look like, at least from the great powers standard view. And I would love to see more, when they go low, we go high kind of stance. But unfortunately, at the moment, the trend is spiral and it goes really downward. So it's hard for Australia in this position. It's hard to stop the instinct to respond in a very firm way to a very firm language. But it will continue to be challenging for some time, and it's a good sign that Australia has taken it more seriously and taken it to WTO with the trade issues with China rather than just engaging in the diplomatic side.
Thank you. Now, I think we're really running out of time here, and we don't have any questions more to answer. So So I guess thank you very much for joining us, Sharon, all the way from Singapore. Thanks for your insights into the ASEAN communiques, which not many of us have actually read. Huong, good to see you again at an Asia Society Australia event, and Richard, thank you as well.
Sorry for dropping out.
That's okay. We had people who could fill the void for you, so you know, we'll turn back to you for another webinar next time. So just in wrapping up, I need to thank the Australia ASEAN Council for and the Victorian Government for supporting this COVID-19 and Southeast Asia project, which Asia Society Australia is running. And also, I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in around Australia, around the region, for joining us. We're recording this, so it will be available online on the Asia Society Australia YouTube channel as soon as we post it. And I would stay in touch with this project. There'll be much more published on the website, which has a number of essays and interviews with a number of commentators from around Southeast Asia on the sort of issues we've been talking about today and other things. So thank you very much for joining us.